I think it's important to recognize the fact that whenever there is a person or group of people who are engaging in this process of defining something or labeling something or categorizing something, there is certainly a power dynamic that is created. All names, all language, it has power. It defines how we interact with one another. And it also defines kind of, I guess, a balance that's created between how much power and autonomy you have and how much power and autonomy the person or the group who's defining you has. Names stick. I mean, think about your own names, for instance. Think about your nicknames. Think about who calls you what. Think about how you call other people. A very common example I can give is, for instance, names or labels we use for people in our family. You know, you would, for instance, use a specific term for your grandfather or your grandma, based on, you know, obviously the age difference, as opposed to your brother or your sister. So there is a hierarchy in that sense as well, and the same can be applied to any other kind of label or name or, you know, language title that you ascribe to a certain person or thing. Once that's there, it's hard to change. It can even be in the sense of, you know, common brands that we see all around us. If there's a Shipton brand, it's hard to get used to the new name or the new label. And there are two issues at hand here when we think about labeling people or categorizing people using labels. A personal issue and then a political issue. The moment you label something, you also define a part of their identity. Going back to the previous example of our own names, think about ways in which, for instance, your name and the meaning of your name has affected your life, or has affected the way people see you. Think about how that definition or how that identity changes when people use your nickname, for instance, as opposed to your given name or your birth name. And so there's definitely an issue of, you know, names defining certain identities. And if we tie it back to, for instance, disability, think about how a very, very in today's time, it's a very politically incorrect term, but if you use the term handicapped, for instance, versus person with different ability, think about how that would change the identity of that person who has a certain, you know, disability. And also going back to Toni Morrison's code, think about what kind of definition or what kind of identity we're imposing on the person as definers when we use one term versus the other. So there are definitely identity issues, and when we talk about power imbalances between the definers and the defined, naming and labeling can limit the identity or limits the power that the definee has. And then there's a political issue at hand as well, because oftentimes, and certainly if you look at history, the way we've categorized people and the way we've labeled people, usually those people belong to minority groups in that given setting, and it has been the whole idea of the whole process of labeling and categorizing has been used to shun those minorities down. I can think about the Black Rights Movement. I think about the N-word, for instance, and the way that term has certain, you know, connotations, certain limiting negative connotations, which have been used to repress those groups in the past, and even to a certain extent to this day in different ways. So certainly, when we think about language and categorization, not only is there a personal issue that's related to your own identity, but then at the same time, a very, very political issue of a majority group asserting their dominance over a minority group in a given setting. And so moving on from the ways in which the issues at hand when it comes to naming, of course, that will hold consequences as well. And two ways in which I like to think about what the consequences of naming a certain individual or group of people can be is A, associations. The moment you label somebody, there is certainly an idea that you have of what that person is like or what that group is like, what they're able to do or what they're not able to do, and ways in which you should interact with them. Since we're talking about disabilities here, different terms that have been used to label people who have disabilities in the past certainly create this like idea, social and psychological, of what these people are, like, you know, that's what I mean. Like, I'm already othering them by using, you know, the language here, or what these or the connotations they hold, or what they're able to do, how they must be interacted with, and a history of medical anthropology and disability studies shows us that the term handicapped, differently abled, disabled, whatever you will, has created this like imaginary of a perpetually ill patient who needs to be helped or who is in some way less, or who in just some way needs more support than somebody who does not have that condition with. So the association that you have with a particular label plays a very important role in how those people function in society, or how they're interacted with, or how they interact with other people as well. And then there's always this danger of generalization, which is assuming that anyone who has a particular condition of disability has the same experience as everybody else in that group, which is definitely not the case. A disability is a very human experience is individual. So is disability. Any kind of disability would have its own individual experience for the person who is going through whatever they're going through. But by calling somebody blind, for instance, it runs the danger of assuming that everybody who is blind or visually impaired or whatever, again, you label that condition as, is going through the same experience. The danger then is that anything you do to mitigate that condition can also run the risk of being a generalized thing, which does not really apply to each person's individual condition. And so there are, of course, many other consequences of naming, but these are the two that are very integral to what I'm researching and looking at. And so are there any questions at this point about anything I've said? Any thoughts? Just wanted to check in. Okay, perfect. I just have a couple more slides on that. And so the disability experience, which I'm, researching in the UAE, here, as well as in other parts of the world, can be something that is very isolatory. There is a perceived kind of need almost by people to, in some senses, hide what the disability is, or even if not hide, not to interact with the disability as much as you would with an individual, for instance, who may not have that kind of disability. And this does not just go for disability; it also goes for any other kind of, social kind of description that you may ascribe to a certain group. Usually, these are minority groups. But in other cases, going back to the example, for instance, of the Black movement, there was, even within the minority group, there was a certain community that was built, which then ended up in the US, for instance, in the civil rights movement and so on and so forth. But as opposed to that, if you look at disabilities, there is still a lack of community within those who are categorized by the society as disabled. It is still a very much more isolatory experience than experiences of other minority or repressed groups currently and in the past. And that's something very important to note as you go about researching this topic, whether from a medical perspective or a social perspective. And then, of course, there is this burden, as is always the case with minority groups, of being socialized into the world of the majority or the world of the normal, quote unquote. There's always, the idea that if you're doing something that quote unquote normal people will be doing, that oh my gosh, this person is so amazing, and they can do this or they can do that or they can do whatever the other people are doing, which unknowingly creates a burden that okay, you have to ascribe to our norms of what society is supposed to do, as opposed to really reveling in what your unique experience may be like. And so those two things can be things which can be very, very, very burdensome on whoever is going through a particular condition of disability. And naming again plays a very important role in that.
Just a quick question: when it comes to like disenfranchised people, whether it be minority groups or disability, people that happen to be otherwise able, like if they don't fit the typical like persona of it, for instance, like some people will be like Black but then like white passing, or for instance they'll have like some type of disability but it's not very like visual or noticeable. How do people like that usually find their identity, where they still attribute to the group but they're not always treated with the same type of like biases and type of like microaggressions? How do they find that sense of identity?
Great. So I haven't personally interacted with I haven't had one-to-one interactions with anybody who holds such an identity, but I've certainly been a part of gatherings where this topic has been brought up. And I think that naturally makes the situation even worse in some senses, because you're not either or, you're kind of in this gray space where people of one group would be, so if I'm understanding you correctly, it would be, for instance, somebody who has a disability but may not, it's not seen necessarily.
Not very, yes.
So either like your from two ends, in a sense that those who are quote unquote visibly, disabled, would think that, oh, like, you don't seem to, belong to this group, in the sense that it seems you can do what people in the other group can do, and so it seems like you're more related to them, in a sense. But then that group thinks the opposite, and you don't kind of get acceptance, if that's what you're asking, from either group, and so that creates a kind of even additional, burden, like, where do I fit? It's also an issue that a lot of people, for instance, who call different places home, or third generation kids, is that the right term for it? I'm not sure. But you don't know what to call home necessarily. You don't know whether you belong to country A or country B, or kind of in this limbo C. So yeah, that definitely adds an additional burden. Okay, so enough about that background. Sorry, I got a bit theoretical. I get carried away with this topic sometimes. So a little bit about my research. I do what is called an ethnographic field research, so it's very, very qualitative. I go out, talk to a lot of people, find myself in different focus groups. I'm present in settings where disabilities are being discussed or enacted in one way or the other, and it's a lot of observational work. So in the UAE, ever since I would say the World Games happened, there has been a huge push towards the visibility of disabilities. When it came to law and policy, I mean, even as early as 2006, when the term people determination first became visible, there have been different policies and like government agendas that have been set. But I think really it took a huge international event, global event to happen for people to really recognize that disabilities can be something that can be a part of our everyday life structure. And so what the climate is like right now is, I've discovered at least that there are a lot of people who want to share their stories. There are different platforms in which this is already being done. If you look at kind of the social activism sphere, there are a lot of media platforms where stories are continuously being shared. There are NGOs and social incubators that are working towards offering solutions or solutions to the problem. But a lot of work is being done both on a government level and on a grassroots level to for disabilities. And the people that I've worked closely with in my particular research are folks, for instance, who run the Mohammed bin Zayed Center or Mohammed bin Rashid Center for Special Needs, or people who have done the Special Olympics, who did the Special Olympics World Games. And these are folks who come from a wide variety of backgrounds. A lot of them are Emiratis, a lot of them are non-Emiratis and come from all over the world. And they all have a different perspective to share. And they want to share as well. I think the stigmatization which existed 10 years ago is definitely not the same now. And if you, for instance, if you look at these pictures, for instance, there are so many different ways in which the idea that disability exists and is present in the community is showcased. I'm not saying we're 100% there and it's all good, but there's definitely a drive towards creating more visibility, which comes sometimes with negative consequences, but generally speaking is good, because once you recognize the idea that disabled people with disabilities are present in the community, then you can work towards making sure that they're treated equitably. And so when you look at these pictures, what are some things that come to your mind?
The difficulty of access.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't see I don't know if a ramp would be appropriate, or it doesn't seem very welcoming.
Yeah, some happy pictures.
Yeah.
Great.
But do disabled people who you've interacted with like seeing these kind of things, or are they like, okay, great, I have handicap parking, or are they like, oh man, I'm gonna park in handicap parking?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. I don't think I've ever. That's not a question I've asked before, so I can't speak for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I think overall, generally speaking, people appreciate the fact that there are accommodations that are being made, because that just makes it easier. That just makes mobility and movement in society a little bit easier. I don't know quite the answer to your question though, whether they like it or hate it.
It's personal.
Yeah, it's up to the individual.
And like you said, it may be different for each person how they feel about that. But I almost wonder, like, is it a bit isolating to have a special card, as opposed to having a card and then communicating independently that condition to whoever you're interacting with. It almost seems to ascribe a part of you, like something that you may not consider to be, central, or you may, and it's different. But that was an interesting interplay between identity, I guess, condition.
That's a very good point. Because even if you want, like, whether you want it or not, if you want to be in that space, then you would have to perhaps present that card and be like, hi, I need certain accommodations to be able to enjoy that beach, for instance, or what have you. And it presents an interesting catch-22 kind of situation that, by presenting that card and by taking on that identity for yourself and by promoting it, you're creating some sense of isolation because you're part of that, categorical group. But then if you don't do that, then also there is isolation because you're not actively, like, you're perhaps not able to actively engage with the community beyond. Any other thoughts about what's up there? Do any of these provisions, like, do they seem familiar to you? Have you seen certain signs like these when you go out? Yes.
Yeah, that was something to say. At least for the website work, that's not something I've seen before. So it's surprising for me to see, but also nice. But I also wonder, where is it?
Yeah.
Where would you see these kinds of things, and where,
Right.
which, for example, which companies or which organizations focus on these accommodations as opposed to others who don't?
Right. No, that's a good point. This particular one was in the Ministry of Community Development, if I'm not mistaken, and that is one ministry that's very, very actively working towards provisions for people of determination. But no, that's a very good point, because then when you think about, and that goes back to your point about access as well, like which places are the ones which are taking on this, responsibility of making sure they provide access versus which are the ones that aren't. And then what is influencing them? For a ministry, if there's a federal mandate to, be more inclusive and provide accommodations, it makes sense. But what about private companies, for instance? Some of them are taking the move to be more inclusive, others are not. What implications does that hold for people of determination, and what implications does that hold for people's mobilities in different spaces? So that's a very good point. This is something again that I found on the Ministry of Community Development's one of their pages online, I think. And there's this logo for people of determination. And then can somebody please read out for me the 3 points that accompany that logo? Anyone want to
From
volunteer?
disabled to people of determination.
Yeah, that's one. Fatima, were you gonna say?
From stillness and neglect to movement and vitality.
And then the
You're
third
not
one.
reading from straight.
Transformation in shape and content.
Yeah.
You're not reading from straight.
What are some immediate thoughts that come to people's minds when they read these 3 motivations, let's put it that way, behind this logo, or even this term? What comes to your mind immediately? Yes.
I could definitely see the movement,
Mm-hmm.
but I guess something, I don't know if I'd say negative about the logo, but it
There is a
gives
negative connotation.
Mhm.
There
it
is.
gives
I
a
think
visual
so. I think so.
identity,
Mhm.
like a specific one.
It's a stigma.
Yeah. Do you want to elaborate on that, or what
It's
part
just a
of stigma?
visual stigma, it's technically someone on a wheelchair sort of a thing. So that logo has a negative sort of, connotation, I guess, to me personally, maybe to others as well, but it definitely has that. Maybe people of determination is good.
Mhm.
I like the way that's put because, special or whatever, they're not using those kind of words or language, but the logo has got something that gives me that negative sort of.
I think to expand on that, it's like the continuous association with people of determination and the wheelchair. And I don't necessarily think a wheelchair is like negative, but I do know from my experience with a friend who is otherwise, so she has a special automated scooter, and when her scooter is periodically broken, she may need to use a wheelchair. And I've seen her disdain towards having, a wheelchair instead of her automated scooter, just because it gives her more autonomy when she's using it. So I do wonder what is the, I guess, rationale behind the continued association of the wheelchair with disability, because that's not the only kind of people determination that.
Yeah, and we talked about like individualized experiences and no generalizations, but sometimes representations like these can create the sort of generalization that I alluded to earlier. Were you gonna add something? Oh, sorry. What about the language that you see, from disabled to people of determination, from stillness and neglect to a movement and vitality? Does that evoke any kind of reaction in you in terms of the motivation behind this change? Of not just the logo but the term itself, which we'll get to in a short bit.
I think it's like changes the perspective. It's like the person still has to go through the same struggle, but it gives you a new perspective and it gives you an opportunity to look at it in an empowering sense. That's pretty much it.
Yeah, and there's certainly say movement and towards movement and vitality. And one thing that Fatma, for instance, picked out earlier was that movement aspect or that mobility aspect seems to be emanating from this logo, however else problematic it may be for some people. But no, those are all certainly very good points in the sense that a shift is noticeable, not only in the fabric of this country's history, but also in the way people have been wielding language, which has been the main focus of my little session here. And so, people of determination, Ashabul Hamam in Arabic. What do you guys think about this term? I said I would make this like very interactive, so totally throwing this on you guys again. What do you think of the term? Do we like it? Do we not like it? Is it more nuanced? Are we in the gray? Are there both positive and negative aspects to this term? And I also kind of want to throw the ball to folks who haven't had a chance to speak yet.
I think it's nice, but it's not globalized yet, I think, because most people, not in the UAE, I don't think they would understand this term. They still use disabled to name a disabled person rather than people with determination.
What do you find particularly nice about the use of this term?
Because it tells you that even though you have a disability, it doesn't mean that you have limits, Just like there's an American author called Helen Keller, you know about her?
Yes.
She was deaf and blind, so basically she's like living in a tomb. She can't see or she can't do anything, But yet she learned how to write and how to speak to people. She actually learned how to speak. So this term actually is more appropriate because just because you have a disability doesn't mean that you can't do stuff. Just because you're blind and deaf doesn't mean that you can't speak. So I think it's really nice and it's actually positive.
Yeah. So you think it creates a sense of like empowerment and like nothing is impossible kind of connotation? That's fair. Were you gonna add something to that?
No, I agree to that.
Yeah. What are some other ideas about the usage of the term? Perhaps in your own experiences, if you've heard the term.
Never.
Never before
Never.
coming to the UAE or today?
Just generally, I've never heard this term before.
Oh, okay.
When I heard this term, I was actually quite impressed that UAE took the step forward to actually take notice of, disabled people and give them that platform to give them motivation to be known as people of determination to overcome whatever it is that they're, going through. That's lovely. I've never seen this anywhere else in the world. So that's beautiful. And all those pictures that you put in the previous slide, I've seen those kind of things around. And I just love how they take that so seriously because really I've never seen it anywhere else. It's beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's certainly a drive that I've seen, in this country than other countries to quickly adopt this name and actually have a governmental push from top down for the adoption of the term. And it has been picked up very, very quickly. So that again, that's a very good observation. Determination. it's an adjective, right? Yes, is it? It's an adjective, I think. Wow, my language is for a person who's doing the capstone language. It's a characteristic, is what I'm trying to say. Why do you think that determination is a characteristic which was put inside this term?
If we're looking at it like cynically, you could say that there are people, because of their disabilities, they're lacking somehow in life. So to overcome that gap in whatever they need to do, they need to have more determination than other people, and somehow so it is definitely better than disabled people, but I wonder if perhaps I wonder what the people themselves, people of determination, think of that term.
Yeah.
What are some thoughts on this particular idea of having to be determined if you are indeed disabled?
I think it's kind of like sad and melancholy when you think about it, because like in movies and just like in popular media, we always try to frame it like people have had to overcome so much, and that they use their determination as a force to push them to excel and do great things, which is great, you know, for us as the people that reap the benefits of it. But it's always like you put this like imaginary chip on people's shoulders that because you aren't able to do certain things, that you should do other things even better on. But I think like back to the point that you had made about like isolation, like it's just a desire to want to, you know, feel normalized and just, you know, go about things, you know, day by day, just as regular.
He wants you to repeat that on the mic.
Oh, yeah. That was off the cuff. Yeah, I don't know if I could. All right. What was it? Okay.
Yeah.
Just to the point that you had about isolation, I think that we put almost an imaginary chip on people's shoulders that have to overcome some form of disability, that they should achieve, you know, humongous things in life, when it's just, you know, a desire to want to feel normalized and be accepted. That's a general consensus amongst like most people. So determination can, you know, we look at it as we like to romanticize it, but then also like determination, it can be like a hindering factor, because we have to just overcome, or people with disabilities, I should say, have to overcome so much.
Right. And then on the point of overcoming, it's also interesting to think about what it is that you're trying to overcome. And a very famous example, going back to the wheelchair again, a very famous example that's given in this sense is, you know, you want to get from the first floor to the third floor, for instance, and you see like a flight of stairs in front of you, and when is the disability activated? Would it have been activated if there was a ramp instead of a set of stairs? And would you need to then have that kind of like extra push and determination to get up? You know, in that context, if there was a ramp instead of a staircase. And so what is it that's, you know, activating that sense or that urgency to be determined to overcome a barrier? And who is imposing the barrier? It's the same people who are also imposing the term on you, which is, again, you know, makes us think and makes us wonder that what is it that actually constitutes the disability? And from whose perspective are we viewing the disability?